All right, the federal government is moving forward with plans to collect DNA samples of anyone coming across the border seeking asylum. The DOJ is planning to publish an amended regulation today that would mandate the collection for almost all migrants who cross in between official entry points and held by CBP. So this rule would not apply to legal permanent residents or anyone entering into the U.S. legally and those under age 14, but not yet clear if asylum seekers who cross through official points of entry will be exempt. So for more on this, we're turning now to investigative journalist Ben Swann. So Ben, this new move by the feds would allow the government to amass a trove of biometric data on essentially millions of people. What sort of privacy concerns do you have about this move?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of concerns here. First of all, this is very questionable legal ground because there's really no precedent for it so far, right? The idea that you're going to collect DNA samples from everybody who was caught crossing the border between a legal port of entry, who's over the age of 14, you're then going to catalog that and you're going to store it someplace. So there's a lot of questions about the security of that, but there's also questions about the fact that right now we allow felons, if you're convicted of a felony, to have your DNA essentially taken and cataloged from you. But in this case, these people are not committing felonies. So you're kind of creating a new class of offense that goes into DNA collection. And so the question becomes, how could this be used or even misused in the future by again, collecting and cataloging all this. So there's major questions surrounding this.
So Ben, you touched on this. There are no laws in the books about collecting migrant DNA samples, especially in this case in particular, migrant DNA samples. So the Trump administration would really be setting precedents here. They say this move is to potentially help solve more crimes in the future should they be committed by migrants. Isn't it their right to initiate whatever moves they see fit to protect the homeland, though?
Well, ultimately, that's what a court is going to decide, right? It's not for me to decide or even for the president to decide, because this will undoubtedly be challenged in court. It will go through the court system, and the courts will have to decide whether or not this falls into a reasonable expectation by the Customs and Border Protection or ICE agents to be able to collect this information. I will tell you this, one thing that's going to be interesting is that among the kind of categories they have here are people who are stopped and even detained briefly by Customs and Border Protection who are believed to be migrants. So if you stop and detain people and then let them go, you're still swabbing their cheeks. So there's a lot of questions here about how long someone has to be detained, whether they have to be caught in an area where they're seen crossing the border. How do we know that just because someone is there that they've automatically crossed the border illegally? Now, look, we know that agents know this stuff when they're out there, but there have to be legal definitions for what constitutes that ultimate search. And the other question is whether or not these people do have certain rights under the law that protect them from this, because once they're in the United States, whether you are a citizen or not, you are still protected by the Constitution when you are on American soil. And does this become an unlawful search and seizure of private information by swabbing someone who you have not been able to prove has committed a crime?
Yeah, there certainly has not been much clarification from the Trump administration or the DOJ in what the actual procedures are going to be for this this move. And Ben, so the DNA profile collection, you touched on this earlier, is allowed under a 2009 law that was expanded, requiring any adult arrested for a federal crime to provide a DNA sample. Do you see this as sort of changing the narrative as far as migrants go to fit, this famous Trump line of migrants being drug mules and murderers and the like?
Well, I think I think ultimately there could be a value to this, right? And so I say that very with great trepidation. There could be a value to the fact that when someone comes across and you are able to check their DNA and collect it, and then later on when they've come across their 6th time or 8th time and they've committed a crime, you might be able to track them to it. But let me tell you this, Manila. Across the country, different states have different laws. I was actually reporting on a case that became law in New Mexico years and years ago, before that 2009 law. It was called Katie's Law. It's the case where a young woman was brutally raped and murdered, her assailant and her murderer ultimately was behind bars for years, and that's why they couldn't find the person responsible. It was only through DNA they ultimately were able to figure out who had committed this crime. So that law became law in the state of New Mexico, Katie's law. There is value, I think, in terms of being able to match some of this, but we have to also weigh whether or not just because someone comes across the border in a certain way, which is a crime, by the way, it is illegal to cross the border outside of those areas. Does it become a slippery slope where now you say, well, basically all crimes, every crime, including getting parking tickets, results in your DNA being collected? I think there's a bigger issue here, not about the crime part of it, but about the fact that ultimately we are headed down a road of collection of everyone's DNA to be stored and cataloged by the government. I think that's where we're ultimately headed, and I think this becomes another stepping stone in that process.
Yeah, and certainly I think you and I both share the skepticism about how safely guarded everyone's DNA would be once they amass everybody's DNA coming in and out of borders. You know, it could be just in the future, Ben, you and I traveling to, I don't know, France or something, and they're going to swab you then to be like, okay, I want to verify that you are Ben Swann. But, you know, that's a different argument. That's a different conversation for another day. As always, appreciate your take.
Eventually, yeah.
Yeah, I think eventually we're headed that way, Ben. And I'm sure you and I will talk about this very soon. As always, Ben Swann, appreciate your take.
Manila, thanks.
Hey YouTube, thanks for checking out our channel. We hope you enjoyed the video. We have tons of content for you just like this. For more of RT America's one-of-a-kind news and analysis, be sure to subscribe and never stop questioning more.